Hi, my name is Martin Kerrigan. This presentation has to deal with transitioning with brain injury, navigating through school, career, and life. There are several objectives which I hope to achieve through this presentation. I'd like to define transition and different types of transition that a student with a brain injury may undergo, to discuss why transition is different for a student with a brain injury than for other students, to discuss the importance of transition planning for a student with brain injury, and to discuss practical strategies and best practices when helping a student with a brain injury transition. Okay, so what is transition? So the word transition, the traditional definition, the overall definition, it's a noun, and it's the process or a period of changing from one state or condition to another. As a verb, it means to undergo or to cause to undergo a process or period of transition. Educationally speaking, transition usually refers to the process of preparing a student to enter a post-school environment. The purpose is to facilitate the student's move from school to post-school activities. Okay, what about the student who has a brain injury? When transition is used in the world of education, we're usually talking about referring from the move from one school to another. There are many transitions that take place for a student following a traumatic brain injury. For the purpose of this presentation, we're really going to try and focus on the transition back to the educational setting. So, as I said, the transition can impact the education of a student with a brain injury. Now, traditionally what you have is the student being hospitalized following the initial injury. Then you usually have, or you can have, transition from the hospital to some type of rehabilitation setting, which may be inpatient, outpatient, and it may or may not include the school. And then finally, you have the student returning to school. However, there can be many different subcomponents to this cycle. For example, there may be multiple transitions just within the medical setting. There's also the increasing expectation that schools pick up the real rehabilitation piece as well. So you're going to have students who are being discharged from hospitals and returning to school sooner than they used to. And therefore, some components of these different transitions are happening within the school themselves. It's also worth noting that for many of these students, the other non-educational pieces of transition are still going to be happening within a school setting. School professionals need to be aware of this and should be prepared to assist with these other types of transitions. This includes many different components, but can best be summed up as helping the student transition into a new way of living. When discussing students with brain injuries, there are multiple transitions that need to be considered, as I just stated. These students, and this is the case for most individuals, will be making multiple transitions throughout their lives, especially through their lives as they recover from their injuries. It is due to the unique nature of these injuries and their subsequent recoveries that transition for individuals with brain injury becomes so critical to their long-term success. If we take care of it and do it right now, the outcomes will be better later on. So why is effective transition planning so important for students with brain injuries? Typically, for students with brain injuries, especially those that obtain their injury in high school, the emphasis is on completing their academic graduation requirements. This is usually very well intentioned. The school wants to see the student get their diploma. They earned it. They had this very unfortunate thing that happened to them. While this is understandable and even commendable, in the long run, this attitude can be detrimental to the student with a brain injury and their long-term success. This is because once a student leaves school, they are no longer entitled to receive the services that they previously got while they were in school. So why is effective transition planning so important for students with brain injuries? So, one research article found that adolescents with TBI face unique challenges as they prepare for adulthood. Evidence has shown continuing medical and physical problems as well as vocational and education difficulties for adults with brain injury. Another study found that for adult survivors, looked at adult survivors of childhood traumatic brain injury, and they found that the injury sequelae persisted into adulthood and negatively affected both educational achievement and employment status. For many individuals that incur a brain injury resulting in the onset of a disability, it is more than just their academic capabilities that are affected. Effective transition planning for students with brain injuries should include life skills. A study was done, the National Longitudinal Transition Survey, and found that 28% of parents of all students with disabilities reported that their transition-age children need life skills. About 40% of parents of students with autism and emotional disturbances felt that their children needed life skills. However, nearly 80% of parents of children with traumatic brain injuries felt that their children required life skills training. So this slide is important for several reasons. One of the important things to point out is that part of effective transition, and I'm talking all types of transition, is knowing how to act or behave in a given situation. For many individuals with brain injuries, the ability to regulate emotions and behaviors is compromised. This can be due to a variety of different factors. One likely cause is that brain injury is usually a sudden onset, whereas with most other disabilities, the student was born with it or the onset was gradual and happened at an earlier age. This in turn allowed for both the family and the individual to plan for it, to adapt to it, and to get used to it. However, traumatic brain injury is often a sudden event, and traumatic brain injury oftentimes is not planned for. You don't know that it's going to happen. So when it does happen, you're dealing with a totally different student or different individual. However, traumatic brain injury oftentimes also impacts the frontal lobe of individuals. So the frontal lobe serves as the executive functioning part of the brain. It's kind of like the command center. The frontal lobe begins its final stages of development in adolescence and continues in early adulthood. And it is also typically happens later in males than in females. So, going back to this slide, while the student may be able to identify the proper way to behave or what is considered normal expectations, they may have difficulty acting on this knowledge, especially if they have not had the proper cognitive remediation and retraining. I like to compare this to giving an individual a bunch of tools, but not teaching them how to use the tools. So they've been given the interventions, but they haven't been taught how to use them and how it's appropriate and what it's going to look like for them. The return to school. So these are really important things to keep in mind when we're talking about students with brain injuries. And all these things may not be present, and they all may be present. They may be present just a few or any combination. And there may be additional things that are not listed up there. But however, oftentimes you're going to find that the student is not the same student as they were prior to their injury. There's likely going to be some anger and some frustration on behalf of the student, and that is very understandable. They just want to get back to normal. There's a sense of loss. They're dealing with that sense of loss, and there's often disinhibition. Disinhibition is not doing socially acceptable or appropriate things at the right time or at the socially expected places and times. However, it is also important to mention that brain injury strengths and weaknesses are often exacerbated. This is also a good time to mention the importance of a neuropsychiatric evaluation. Often these evaluations offer the best insight as to the student's current level of functioning and their strengths and their weaknesses. However, it is equally important to note that this is a snapshot of the students where they are at presently and their present level of functioning, and is not necessarily a permanent diagnosis or permanent indicator of where they are at. The findings of the neuropsychological report should be used to guide the student's education. It is also imperative to mention the importance of frequently revisiting the findings of the neuropsychological report, especially the closer to the injury, as there are often many changes that happen and take place during the first 2 years following a brain injury. This is an important slide. It was a research, and it found that those students with brain injuries who were employed at school exit generally had more severe injuries had an earlier age of injury and were less likely to have had rehabilitation services. This suggests that they received more school-based employment assistance than those with less severe injuries. So at first sight, this is contradictory. Why would somebody with a more severe injury be more likely to be employed? And it's probably most likely because they had the right interventions and supports, thereby or leading to better outcomes. This stresses the significance of early interventions and appropriate interventions. While the student's ability to be successful in school is important, it is also equally, if not more, important that the student be able to function in society and according to societal norms. This individual is not going to be a student forever. They're going to be out in the real world. For many individuals with brain injuries, there's a deficit in reteaching appropriate behaviors. So best practices for transition planning for students with a brain injury. One of the most important things is to make the student and their family the center of the planning. One study found that students who actively participated in transition planning were significantly more likely to be currently employed and be ever engaged in employment after high school up to 8 years. While students who were moderately active or leaders in the transition planning process, the odds for them to be currently employed or ever employed were higher compared to others who were not involved. When general education, academic teachers participated actively in transition planning, students were nearly 4 times as likely to ever be engaged in employment after high school than students who were not. The active involvement of special education teachers was also strongly associated with the increased odds of students' current employment or ever being employed after high school. School administrators' participation in students' transition process was also associated with increased odds of students ever being employed after high school. So this study definitely reinforces the idea that all disciplines that work with the student should be part of the transition planning, including those professionals that may not be part of the school system. As the student begins to make the move to their next steps, include the individuals from what comes next, as was stated before. Also, start the transition planning process as soon as possible. So, what are the best practices for transition planning for students with brain injuries? Keep in mind that the closer the injury, the greater the chance of denial over their limitations. Allow for the individual who is transitioning to experience natural consequences, and this includes both positive and negative consequences. Incorporate social skills and behavior supports in planning. The social skills and behavior supports is essential because this is one of the areas that we have found, and was stated earlier, there is a significant deficit for students with brain injuries compared to their non-brain injured peers. So we're going to take a look at 2 different students that I've become aware of over my career. So first we have Bart. So Bart was a high school student who was injured in a car accident. He was hospitalized. After he medically stabilized, he returned to school. He returned to school and he did not receive the appropriate interventions and supports. He was given general or common accommodation services, but they didn't really address the underlying causes of the brain injury. Within a matter of months, Bart was now one of the most restrictive placements in the state of Maryland. He was in a locked-door residential facility with a diagnosis of emotional disturbance. Brain injury was never included in discussion of how to meet Bart's needs, and Bart continued to struggle because none of the service he got addressed his brain injury. Now let's take a look at Homer. Homer was a high school student also involved in a car accident. And Homer's car accident initially was much more severe than Bart's. However, Homer got the appropriate rehabilitation in addition to medical care. After returning to school, Homer continued to get appropriate services and interventions. Homer was able to return to his previous school, graduate with a high school diploma, and then was able to go on to college where he continued to get appropriate services and interventions. Homer has been employed as a paraeducator in a public school system, in addition to holding several other jobs. So Bart's got appropriate rehabilitation, but did not include cognitive remediation and therapy that addressed the deficits as a result of the brain injury. Homer did get those supports that addressed his deficits following his brain injury. For both Bart and Homer, the services they received helped address their learning needs and taught them how to access curriculum with supports, modifications, and accommodations. In other words, the educational component was effective and was even appropriate. However, the components of addressing changes in behavior and cognition, or thinking, was only addressed in Homer. So even though Bart received services and interventions, they did not address all his needs, and therefore, he was not successful. On the other hand, Homer got the services, and though he is still impacted and affected by his brain injury, he has been able to become a productive, contributing member of society. I do want to mention that it is worth noting that Homer's mother had a PhD in speech-language pathology at the time of her son's injury, and she knew what to ask for and what services her son needed. Unfortunately, in this scenario, the story of Bart is much more common than the story of Homer. There are some resources that are available to look at when it comes to transition planning for students with brain injuries. Involve the Maryland Division of Rehabilitation Services, commonly referred to as DORS, in transition planning. DORS is also a part of the State Department of Education. It's a subcomponent of it. They can really help with transition planning, and they do have some people on staff who are familiar with transitioning for individuals with brain injuries, both youth and adults. There's a transition toolkit for students with traumatic brain injury. There's a website, the Model Systems Knowledge Translation Center fact sheet, Returning to School After Traumatic Brain Injury, that does discuss some components of transition in it, and the Brain Injury Association of Maryland is a great resource as well. So, some important things to remember when we're talking about transitioning and transition for students with traumatic brain injury. Be flexible, plan for change. Have frequent meetings to discuss changes, progress, etc. These two bullet points are especially true the closer to the injury you are. There's a lot of change that happens during the first year and 2 years following a traumatic brain injury. This change is often not linear. You may take 3 steps forward, then 2 steps back, or the student may seem to plateau for a while. The nature of brain injury is that there will be continual progress as well as regression, especially the closer to the injury the individual is. Therefore, why you want to have frequent meetings. You can call for reevaluation plannings. There's so much change that happens to that individual. Involve the student as much as possible and wherever possible. In order to have the best chance of success, you want the individual and the student to be invested in their own learning. Therefore, they should have a seat at the table. Take a multidisciplinary approach. There are different aspects to the student and to their recovery. The different professionals working with the student in different capacities may have to offer different insights. Build on pre-injury strengths. Many times it is common that an individual with a brain injury, their pre-injury strengths are what they rely on. That becomes their go-to. They are comfortable and feel safe using these strategies. And lastly, be creative. That is self-explanatory. Thank you for your time, and there is a list of sources for you to access if you're interested. Thank you.